Welcome to the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Greene, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change. All right. Good morning, everybody. Today I thought I would sit down and talk a little bit about my background in Zen meditation training and how that led into the work that I do with bodywork and trauma therapy. So I thought today would be a good day to share some of that story. Yeah. So for myself, I got interested in the body well before I ended up doing any kind of work therapeutically as a body worker or as a, as a body worker or somatic worker. For me, my entry point into embodiment studies, if we want to call it that, was when I was about 19 years old and I had finished a year of college and I was doing all kind of intellectual things. I was studying philosophy. I was studying physics. I thought my path was to go on to become a scientist, was sort of what I was interested in at that time. But I had a period when I threw into question my whole sort of scheme of the world, and I don't even remember all the things that contributed, but I had a little bit of a crisis where I thought maybe my rationalistic and sort of mathematical approach to understanding the world and creating meaning, I realized it wasn't enough. Um, and my father had been, during my youth, my dad had been very deeply involved in Zen training at a temple in Hawaii. And I had visited there a few times. I, knew a thing or two about it. On some summer breaks, I would study Aikido or, martial art with my dad when I was a kid growing up. But I really didn't know much about, um, Zen or Buddhism. It was pretty not on my radar. And it's funny, a little bit funny looking back because when I would visit my dad, a big thing I would do is look and see what books were on his bookshelf. He has thousands of books. He's a huge book collector and book reader. And I was very familiar with his books about science, and I had read all kinds of books on physics and biology and things like that. And I sort of had forgotten that about half of his books, like sort of the other half of the shelf, were philosophical texts and texts on Zen and Buddhism and Chinese history and all of this stuff. And it was funny to me that I had never wondered, what that had been about for him. So anyway, after my freshman year of college, I uh, thought, well, geez, I don't think I really know that much about, or I've had a limited view about, sort of interpreting the world and things. And so in a little bit of a crisis mode, I spoke with my dad and I said, hey, what's this Buddhism thing? What's this Zen thing that you've been doing? Does that have anything to offer? And he said, well, it might, but there's no way to know without sort of trying it. So if you're curious about this approach, this path, why don't you take your summer break, come here to Hawaii, and just give it your all, do a deep dive, and see if you'll find out if it's has something there for you or not. So that's what I did. So that was the summer of 2020, and I went to Honolulu, which I've been many times because that's where my father lived. And but instead of just having kind of a normal summer break or getting a summer job, which was kind of what I had done before, I first he was my teacher, so we got up every morning at 4:45 and set out the meditation cushions and started practicing sitting. And in that style of Zen, there's a big emphasis on martial arts, which I've mentioned in other podcasts so far. And so we, get some wooden or bamboo swords, and we were doing, hundreds or thousands of sword cuts, and I, I was kind of in shape as a runner, so I was sort of fast and athletic, but I wasn't like strong very. And so actually, one of the exercises he did was, we lived on this very, very steep hill, and he would have me push him. He would just sort of be dead weight, and I had to stand behind him with my hands on his hips and push him up the hill, and over and over again. And that was to develop core strength, or what we call hara, Hara, in the Zen tradition. And so I did that, and to the point of puking a number of times, and blah blah blah. Uh, anyway, so after a few weeks of kind of homegrown training, where, just kind of getting the basics of how to sit and this and that, he started bringing me to the dojo. We call it the dojo, or it's a temple in this place up in Kalihi Valley, which is a part of Honolulu, but up in the mountains. So you have to, drive 20 minutes, and you kind of go up this winding road. And then eventually you're at the top, not the top of the mountains, but kind of deep back into the valleys. And then there's just this very beautiful, remarkable grounds where this temple sits, nestled amongst the trees and backing up to a river. And again, I had been there as a kid for various things, but never for the sake of training. And so he started bringing me there for meditation, for work days. I joined a martial arts class doing kendo and some other things, which I've mentioned previously. And it was intense in the sense that it was physically very demanding for many people. Starting meditation physically, your body has to get used to it. If you join the intensives, like a retreat kind of a program, then you're sitting for many hours. And even if for sitting for an hour or two feels okay, that's a big difference when it's your seventh or your eighth, hour of sitting on a cushion on a given day. Um, and and I found the environment really incredible in terms of the people there. And what I mean by that is, I saw people who were hardworking, who were very tuned in with one another. It was that, there was just a flow to activities, whether it was martial arts, whether it was getting ready for the meals, whether it was cleaning up the grounds as part of the work. And there just were people from all walks of life. There were heavy duty professionals, there were laborers, but it was a place where your title in the outside world, whether you were an executive or traveling in from somewhere, that just completely, when you left that at the door, because in the environment of the training dojo, we were all doing the same thing, which was studying ourselves through body, breath, and posture. Um, and uh, I was really confronted. I had been a person who'd been kind of achieving, but mostly at like the academic level. And my academic self, that didn't get very far, because sort of the concepts of Buddhism and things were not really to be grasped by understanding something intellectually. Buddhism and Zen are about an experiential understanding of oneself, and oneself in connection to the universe, essentially, and with one another. And but so my thinking mind just, kind of kept getting in the way. So I had a conversation at one point with the sort of the founder, more or less the founder, Tanue Roshi, very important person in my life. He was alive for just a couple years at this early stage of my training. And he in a conversation, he said, "Well, what are you really after? Why are you studying all this?" And I kind of didn't, it sort of didn't really have an answer. So he answered it for me. He said, "You're after the meaning of life, right? You want the secret to life." And I said, "Well, I had kind of didn't want to admit that because it sounds so cheesy." But he was correct. That is what I was interested in. And he said, "Well, I'll give you a hint. You will, you're not going to find it intellectually. You're going to find it through the refinement of breath and posture." And I found that so interesting. And so basically, he was saying, throw out your intellectual grasping, go into the meditation practice and the martial arts, and from there, do your searching and your seeking. So that's that is what I did. Um, in terms of body work, there the way that connects is that the style of Zen training that I was a part of, especially at the age I was, which was in my 20s, is the idea is approaching Zen through the body. That's a phrase that we use. There's the other ways to approach Zen, through sound, through any number of means. But this was an approach that we used, and that meant through the physicality of the kind of meditation we did, the physicality of the martial arts, and the physicality of the work. And the work we did, when I say physicality, I mean, sure, it was things like, putting up walls and building things, but we did a lot of moving rocks. We built a lot of rock walls. There's a sort of within this school of Zen, there's this idea that, you should, spend 1,000 hours moving rocks that are, a little bit too heavy for you to lift, and you'll learn something about your body through having to relate to massive objects like that. So that was things like that, wheelbarrows of gravel, blah blah blah. And there was a person. So again, so there's this emphasis on the physical approach to meditation, martial arts, etc. And it's this idea of developing centeredness at the physical level. And coming back to this word hara, again, Hara refers to, so that's a Japanese word. In Chinese, the equivalent would be dantian, sometimes used in Tai Chi, Qigong, things like that. The Japanese equivalent of dantian is tanden, and tanden is considered sort of the psychic center, and it's contained within the this thing called the hara. And so when we do meditation, when we did martial arts, there's the way that we breathe has to do with bringing sort of a physical centeredness below the navel. That's where the hara is. And when we are doing sword cuts, the striking, the phrase we'd say is that you're not cutting out there, you're cutting into your own center. When we would do a shout, because shouting was a part, or chanting. For us, chanting it's not really about the meaning of the words in the sutras that are being chanted, but it's a way to use sound and resonance and physically anchor it in your body, again rooting in the hara, as a practice. So all of these different forms: martial arts, meditation, physical work, chanting practice, uh, the principles were the same, as we were learning to use our body in an integrated way that was physically collected and centered at the hara. Before my time, there had been a very, I guess, important man who had come through the dojo maybe about 10 or 20 years prior to my time, which is around 2000. So I'm thinking maybe the 80s, something like that. And he was a body worker named Dub Lee. And Dub he was a Mormon. He was originally from Utah, bit successful businessman. He had been in World War II as a vet and seen combat. Was a very successful business person in Utah, alcoholic and dissatisfied with life. And at a certain point, kind of late, maybe in his 50s or 60s, something like that, he kind of had left his sort of successful, complacent business career behind, and he got very, very interested in uh, body work. And so he went and he studied Rolfing with Ida Rolf at Esalen in California. He was the person to pay for Moshe Feldenkrais's first plane ticket from Israel to the U.S., where he began teaching the Feldenkrais method here in the United States. And he studied with a number of other folks as well. But primarily, he identified as a Rolfer and a Feldenkrais practitioner in terms of his hands on work. He was a big guy. He was very physical, really sort of big resonance towards this work. He was a big believer in psycho-spiritual transformation through body work. Um, so again, so this larger view, not just fixing alignment or getting rid of back or knee pain, but how do you become more of who you are as a human being? This is a big emphasis of Dub's work. And after having a career in California, I believe for a couple decades, and traveling around doing this work and being quite known within the bodywork circles, he retired to Honolulu, and somebody made the introduction, said, "Hey, you have to come meet this Zen master, Tano Roshi, the guy I was talking about earlier. You have to come meet this Zen master. He's a super gifted body worker, energy worker. You should meet this guy." And so the story, as I understand it, is that Dub, came up for an introduction with Tano Roshi, and Tano Hiroshi's comment was, "Oh, good. I've been waiting for somebody Western trained to cross paths with, because there's some things I want to teach to somebody, but they have to have the foundation in order to learn." And what he meant by that, well, in terms of what he has to teach, is that Tano Hiroshi, in addition to his Zen career, was just a very, very gifted and accomplished martial artist. He had reached high degrees of ranking in a number of different Japanese martial arts, and trained very, very intensively in his youth. And he was quite gifted from a perspective of chi and energetics, to put it simply. So he was a person who, and he also, through all that in training and his work with his own body, he was kind of an intuitive healer. Like, so he could, he could work things out. He could sense what was not functioning properly at the person's body level. And again, because of his uh, orientation towards energetics, he was quite good at sort of adjusting the energetic flow as a way to provide support as well. And so Dub recognized early on that Tano Hiroshi had a deep treasure trove of training and whatnot to teach him. And so I think, if I understand this correctly, Dub was the oldest person to do a formal live-in training. Living in is like being a monk in residence. And I think he was in his 60s, maybe even late 60s, following the schedule, getting up at 4:30, going to bed at 11:30, midnight, whatever it is. Meditating several times per day as part of the daily schedule. And then he was doing a lot of work on people, body work, under the supervision of Tano Hiroshi. And then Tano Hiroshi and him were, Dub was sort of showing some of the techniques from Rolfing and other things. And Tano Hiroshi was teaching Dub how to center himself in the hara, how to meditate, and how to basically extend chi or use ki as part of his bodywork approach. The long story after all of this was that this collaboration and this in-depth training was that Dub ended up creating something called Zen body therapy, his own sort of synthesis of work that was combining Rolfing techniques, trigger point bodywork therapy techniques, Feldenkrais manipulation, hands-on work, and perspective techniques, and then also the rooting in the hara and the influence of vital energy or chi coming from the Zen training, what he had learned from Tano Hiroshi, and started teaching that around the world. So that body of work, Zen body therapy, was my first entry. And he wrote an excellent book, and I'll maybe we'll put a picture here in this podcast and include a link to the book. It's out of print, but you can often find it on Amazon as a used book. And so I'll include that here. Anyway, he wrote a fascinating book about his life story. And I read that early in my training because it spoke a lot about the connection of the body to everything. And it made a huge impression on me because part of the book had all these stories about people releasing trauma and also their personal growth, spiritual growth that was emerging through body work. And it was clear to me reading the book just the sort of the depth of a person or a human that Dub had grown into, sort of the bodywork relationship as a vehicle for, his caring for people and extending compassion and holding space for, their lives and their histories, and providing a, a place where change and growth could happen for them. So it just had left a deep impression on me. He was around when I was in the between the year 2000 and 2003, when I was living full time as a monk in residence at the temple. Um, he was still there. I believe he passed in 2005. He was quite old. He was in his 90s. He was in a wheelchair. He would sometimes come up. Somebody would bring him up to visit, and he was very, kind of well regarded in the community. So I knew him only in that way, but not as a direct student, kind of a way. Many years went by uh, where again, my own Zen training was rooted in the body through meditation and martial arts, voice, things like that. But I didn't, and we sometimes learn some elements of body work, very simple things, working with our feet to step on the big muscles. We learned certain things to help one another in our meditation to loosen up our bodies. So we kind of learned kind of a rough version of body work as just a part of our training. But about 10 years later, I was visiting. I had moved to Wisconsin, and I moved to Wisconsin in 2005 to help my father. So my father ended up buying a piece of land about 45 minutes west of Madison, Wisconsin, for the purpose of developing a rural Zen dojo or a Zen center, which exists today. It's called Chosei Zen, based in Wisconsin. And so I was finishing up my monk in residence training in Honolulu, and I was available, and I had kind of learned a lot of physical skills, carpentry, stuff like that. And so I went to help from a bare piece of land build some of the original buildings to develop this, again, what's become Chosei Zen. And I would travel regularly to Hawaii to continue my training. And I think it was in 2009, I was back there on a trip to the temple uh, for a priest training because I had become ordained as a priest. And we would get together to do, study basically some of the texts and also whatever, just some of the priest things that we would do. And uh, I had a voicemail on my phone, and there was only one place on the temple where I got good reception, was at the top of this hill. So I walked up this hill, listening to my voicemail, and and it's from this guy that I had heard of but had never met before, a man named Everett Ogawa. And I knew that Everett Ogawa was a longtime student of this Zen community. He lived in Chicago, and he had been one of the main bodywork students of Dub. So that is how much I knew about. And I had heard some stories because he was friends with my parents. But again, I'd never met him. And so here's this voicemail, and it's from Everett. And he basics of the message was, hey Alex, you don't know me. I'm Everett. I know your parents, and I understand they've moved to Wisconsin. I'm in Chicago. I'm trying to connect with them. Don't have. I found your number on the internet. I'm leaving you a voicemail. Hey, could you give this phone number to your parents and have them contact me? Something as simple as that. And but for me, what was so striking is a funny thing to remember and to share. But uh, I heard the message, and then I replayed it a couple of times because what was so fascinating to me was that the sound of Everett's voice coming through my phone was so striking to me, and there were a couple things about it. One, it was as though his entire body was speaking. And then I knew, and I could hear from the sound of his voice that it was sort of rooted in the sound was coming from his hara, the center. And again, I kind of knew how to listen to that because of my own training with chanting, martial arts. We paid a lot of attention to that. Uh, so on the one hand, I felt like, whoa, this is a guy who really dropped into his own center, and I could hear that through his voice. But there was another element, which was that in addition to sort of the rootedness and the resonance of his voice, there was also this warmth. And I don't know how to describe it other than the kind of warmth that like made my body relax, made me think, wow, this must be like a really loving person, but not at all in like a sort of an airy fairy way. It was this combination of this rooted person and a quality of voice that made me think, wow, I would share things, with this person. And that was just through this kind of banal voicemail that I just told you about. So I passed along the message, and a few months later, I was back in Wisconsin, and Everett came to visit uh, in to visit the temple to meet with parents, and he came for a training event. So I met him. We were in this little room getting changed, putting on the clothes that we use for meditation, and he's there and he says, "Oh, hey, I'm Everett." And I said, "Oh, hey." And we just looked at each other. This is the funniest thing. We just laughed for like a little while, just laughed. And the feeling was, at least for me, I never talked about this with him. The feeling was like we knew each other already. We went way back. And I asked him, I said, I know you're a body worker. Do you teach body work? If so, I want to learn from you. And he basically said, "Yeah, I know, and sure, yeah, I'll figure out a way to work with you." And so it was as though we had had this understanding or this conversation, even though this was really the first time that we were meeting. This is one of the only times in my life where sort of meeting with a person kind of was so um, unique in that way. I don't have better words for the sort of the feeling of it. Um, any case, that led to sort of so this was around 2009, and by the end of the year, he had found me a partner. This guy Sergey, who still a dear friend, and Sergey is and was in Chicago, and I was lucky that we got to learn in sort of this just intimate one-on-one environment where Sergey and I were the initial partners. Now, later, I joined bigger cohorts because of the timing of things, groups of students that he taught. But that initial series of learning the basics of the method were, kind of in that one-on-one environment. So, and what I recognized studying it was that this was like a missing piece for me. I really needed to work in this way. And I'll just share a couple things about why it was sort of like the thing I needed to plug into my Zen training. And I wasn't thinking about doing professional work yet. That was not at all my interest. It was again, I thought to myself that this, like I said, when I heard this guy's voice, I thought I need to learn the thing that helped him cultivate that. And so those early months, 6 months of doing it were awesome because in my own self, I realized that this was an incredibly valuable way to strip away the habitual muscle tension patterns and even psycho-emotional patterns that were providing, creating fixations or the way anxiety was showing up in my body, and that it was just this very, very direct way of inhabiting myself in what we might call a more grounded, natural, integrated way. And by that time, I had done a lot of other, I already had done a lot of body stuff. But working at this way, working with the tissue, working with the connective tissue, both deeply but also sensitively, it just opened up my whole consciousness to the idea that there's so much to learn by receiving this kind of work. And then as the next 2 years went by, I I realized it wasn't just what I was learning by being a receiver, but by doing the work. So much I was putting together from my Zen training background. How you use your body to do good body work to me was the same as moving those big rocks, or I had been working on in Wisconsin. We had been cutting trees and sawing trees into boards, and so I had gotten used to sort of moving logs and things like that. And I realized that, and carrying boards and whatnot. And so I realized that doing body work that to work well, to work in a grounded way that was strong but not painful, that was sensitive, and creating change that somebody could absorb. That I needed to use my body in the same way, that we centered way that we cultivate in the meditation and in the martial arts and all of those other things. And so it just was like a hand in glove fit for me. And the other thing that I recognized was, I mentioned earlier that so much of what Dub had learned from Tano Hiroshi was the important role of vital energy, or what's called qi in Chinese, or ki, or ki in the Japanese tradition, um, or the same ki that would be in Reiki, for example. What I realized was that body work was in some ways the ideal vehicle or platform for which to study ki, or ki. I mean, there's lots of other ways, don't get me wrong, but there's something very tangible. You work on enough people, you're starting to sense and feel with your own hands what's happening in the organism that you're working with. Not only your hands, but just the being in the room, starting to sort of connect more at the energetic level. And so I'd say for 2 or 3 years, it just was a huge learning for me of taking some principles that I knew from martial arts and Zen, and recognizing that they applied very directly in the therapeutic relationship in terms of sensing, feeling, and helping to create change with folks. And luckily, I realized that the things I had read in the book, Dub's book, all the sort of powerful things that were happening for people, life changes, and getting releasing of traumas, and growing, and re-remembering who they were, and all these kinds of powerful anecdotes. Um, I started to recognize that, yes, that was real, and it wasn't just about him. That was available in my own sessions with people, and that was certainly true for myself as well. Sort of a big growth at this psycho spiritual, emotional, psychological level. So that was the gateway. And after these 3-4 years where I was just studying it, not professionally, but just using it as a personal practice, at a certain point, I recognized this was the work that I wanted to do with clients professionally. And so I had been running another business. It was a woodworking and construction business. I sort of closed it down, sold parts of the business and equipment to some of my employees who kind of realized the writing was on the wall. And they said, "Alex, really looks like your whole passion and heart has shifted towards body work." And so um, and so we moved in that direction. Yeah, so kind of coming back to, how does the Zen teachings and wisdom, fit into my approach to body work, somatic work more generally now, trauma work. And I guess, a couple things come to mind when I think about that. One of the early things, one of the early lessons that I learned from Tano Roshi is, he said, you know, that it's not about what you do, it's how you be. And in some ways that advice comes up in other traditions too, but very much applies to Zen. It's that it's not what it's not what you're doing, it's not the techniques themselves. They matter, but it's not the techniques themselves. It's who's behind that, who's the person who's delivering. And so in my own approach to body work and somatic work in general, the reason I consider my work just very much an extension of my Zen practice, as a work, arising out of my, commitment to Zen practice as a Zen priest, is that to me it's it's an opportunity to show up for people in the widest and hopefully deepest sense of the word. So I when I'm working with folks, it's not just about what's happening there to the person that I'm working with. When I'm working with folks, it's not just about who I'm that person I'm working with, but my own body posture, presence, concentration is included. And so for me, it's like I can't have an off day because then I'm not doing the work that I'm doing. And so for me, my ongoing commitment to Zen practice, the meditation, is that is the platform from which that's the who that's showing up with the work that I'm doing with people, body work, work over Zoom. It doesn't matter what the setting is. And there's this idea in Zen, a phrase we'll use in martial arts and in Zen in general is this idea of becoming one with, and 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 that the whatever it is we do, if we're making a meal for someone or a group, or if we're pouring tea, or if we're really doing anything, an aim of Zen is to become one with that activity, so that there's not a separateness between yourself and the situation that you're involved in. And to me, there's nothing more interesting, there's nothing more compelling, moving than the work of becoming one with another human being. And that's what I think is happening in the therapeutic relationship, is that two people are coming together and there's this oneness. Now we could use a nervous system like regulation, like co-regulation, this idea that my nervous system affects your nervous system and vice versa. So we've got sort of some Western concepts and language for it. But on the Zen side, it's sort of more basic. We don't try to get into the science of it. There's just this idea that um, the essence of me can encounter the essence of you, and out of that meeting of essences and joining can arise sometimes opportunities for growth and change. um, and so yeah, so the idea, so for me, my work, so I used to, even before body work, I loved working with wood and I loved working with trees, and I still love all those things so much. But something that I realized when I had started my bodywork training was that as much as I loved, becoming one with wood, in the projects that I was doing, there was something like infinitely more rewarding about becoming one with people. And so I knew that I had to move into something where that was the focus of the work, was to become one with others. And that's the joy, that's connecting with people's joy and authenticity and their aliveness. That's part of it. But it's their hurts and their wounds and the stuff that's, holding them back, and that's all a part of it too. And for some reason, for myself, uh, whether again it's body work, doesn't matter the thing, that's who I'm becoming one with, is all of those things. And if something arises out of that, that's in the direction of growth or discovering of who somebody is, then that gives me a huge amount of energy and joy and meaning in the work that I do. So, and there's, I guess I'll quote, there's a phrase from the founder of the Rinzai tradition of Zen. It was this Chinese master Linqi, in Chinese or Rinzai, uh, translated into Japanese. And he has a famous phrase, which is there is a there's a true person of no rank in the mass of naked flesh who goes in and out of your facial features, something like that. That's kind of not the greatest translation, but again, there's this true person of no rank in the body. Who goes in and out of the face, day in and day out. Find this person. So it's this idea of who is the um, who is this true person of no rank? In Zen, we'd call that the original nature or the true self. And so, my view in body work and in somatic work is that that's what I'm trying to help connect with and help uncover for the people that I'm working with. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.